you could be here. I want to thank everybody that took the time and effort to come and visit today on our, when we're going to be talking about proponents and opponents on this bill. And I want to acknowledge that working with the House, they did a fantastic job of putting this bill together for this project, and we really appreciate that as other members of the committee. So with the amount of testimony we have, we need to limit our testimony around 5 minutes so that we get everybody in, make sure we get at least that came here. We want to make sure that happens. So, in order to get started, we will call on the reviser, and welcome to the committee, Tamara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, committee. House Bill 2279, as amended by House Committee, would require groundwater management districts, or GMDs, to submit annual reports to the legislature, and then identify priority areas of concern and submit action plans to the chief engineer. Specifically, Section 1 of the bill would require the board of each groundwater management district to submit to certain House and Senate committees an annual written report on the finances and activities of the district in the calendar year the GMD was most recently audited. If the GMD was not audited in the previous calendar year, that GMD would also have to submit a draft or unaudited report for that previous calendar year. The annual written report would include a detailed financial statement, a description of the activities undertaken by the GMD, and a detailed statement that explains how the board's expenditures serve to further the conservation and reduce consumptive use of water, the prevention of economic deterioration, and the stabilization of agriculture, or otherwise supported the GMD's management program. The financial statement included in the annual report would have to include an itemized list of all income and the source from which that income was received, an itemized list of all expenditures by the board, and an accounting of all assets currently held by the board. A representative of the GMD would be required to appear before any legislative committees upon request. Now getting into Section 2. This section would require that before July 1 of 2024, the board of each GMD would have to identify all priority areas of concern within the GMD and set reasonable boundaries of that area using data from the Kansas Geological Survey or other source approved by the chief engineer. The GMDs would be allowed to seek a 6-month extension upon good cause. Priority areas of concern include areas where the estimated usable lifetime of groundwater is 50 years or less, or an unreasonable deterioration of the quality of groundwater. Priority areas of concern would include areas where the groundwater levels are declining or have declined excessively, the rate of withdrawal of groundwater equals or exceeds the rate of recharge, preventable waste of water is occurring or may occur, or an unreasonable deterioration of the quality of groundwater occurs or may occur. The GMDs would be required to conduct public education and outreach in each priority area of concern and the development of its action plan. The action plan would be submitted to the chief engineer by July 1 of 2026. And within 90 days of that submission, the chief engineer would be required to review the action plan and the identified priority areas of concern. If the plan and priority areas are approved by the chief engineer, the GMD board would implement the action plan as soon as practicable and incorporate it into the GMD's management program at its next annual review. The GMD board would be required to review the priority areas of concern and any action plans every 5 years and update the plan as necessary. If a GMD board fails to identify priority areas of concern, fails to submit an action plan incorporated into a management program, or fails to submit an adequate action plan, the chief engineer may designate priority areas of concern, create an action plan, or take corrective action. The bill would also require certain entities to provide assistance and support to each GMD to comply with action plan requirements. Beginning on January 15th, 2025, GMDs would be required to submit annual reports to certain legislative committees summarizing the activities taken in the previous calendar year to comply with the action plan requirements and priority areas of concern requirements that I just outlined that are contained in Section 2 of the bill. And similarly, a representative of the GMD board would appear before the committees upon request. The bill would take effect on July 1 upon publication in the statute book and pass the House on a vote of 116 to 6, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much for the revisor. Senator Dahl.
Yeah, Senator, so the bill just says an unreasonable deterioration of the quality of groundwater may occur. The bill does not describe what that includes.
Any other questions? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned in your comments that if the groundwater, if the board fails to do one or all three things, what is fails to submit an adequate action plan? Is there definition in the legislation that defines an adequate plan, and who would determine if the plan is adequate? Because it says if they, in your notes, and I haven't read the legislation, that if they fail to submit an adequate action plan, then the chief engineer may design priority areas of concern, et cetera.
Yeah, so let me just clarify. This is on page 3, starting in line 20 in subsection B. It does state that if a board fails to identify priority areas of concern within a district or to submit an action plan to address the concerns in each area identified, the word adequate is not in there, so that is my mistake on the thing. It does say if the board submits a plan that fails to reasonably address the problems within each area identified. So the language in the bill is reasonably, and it does not provide a definition of what that means.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So who determines if it's reasonable?
That's a great question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So, yeah, so I will say that following that, if the GMD fails to do any of those things, it is the chief engineer who can then step in and take the corrective action.
Any other questions? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Tamara. So I'm looking on page 3 on C, where it talks about in the amendment that was added by the House, that all areas within a local enhanced management area shall be considered to be in compliance. So what does that mean? I understand that that may work if the entire groundwater district is in a LEMA, but if just part of it is, what effect does that have on the rest of the responsibilities of that board of the district?
So the language you're referring to does say all areas within a LEMA shall be considered to be in compliance. So the way that I am understanding that is the area that is only in the LEMA would be in compliance, and any area of the GMD that is outside that LEMA would be subject to all the requirements of the section.
Thank you. I think some of my concern is that the other parts of the section refer to districts, not individual LEMAs.
Any other questions? Your 5 minutes is up. So, anyway, so we'll open the hearing on House Bill 2279, and we will begin with first proponent, Representative James Minix from the Kansas House. Welcome to our committee.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Kirshen. I want to talk a little bit more about the process of how we got to this point on this bill and another one you're going to hear this week. The House Water Committees met diligently over the last 3 years. I realized the chairman said we quickly brought this bill to you. It seems like we've been 3 years in this process. We attacked the water issues here in the state of Kansas with the philosophy that it's not rural and it isn't urban. It isn't a partisan issue. The water of the state of Kansas belongs to all the citizens here. And we do have a problem. We don't want to wind up like we're seeing other parts of our country at this time. So we've met over 50 times, over 75 hours, a couple of times in the summer. And we've got some really bright minds back here, 17 members of a committee that's worked together as a team. I'm very proud of the output that they've brought forward to you. I'll allow them to get into the details of things, but I just wanted you guys to understand what the process has been, and I'd sure stand for questions.
All right, thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Minnick? Seeing none, thank you very much. Next up, we have Representative Lindsey Vaughn as a proponent. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members of the committee. As the chair mentioned, I also serve on the House Water Committee as the ranking member. And I wanted to also provide testimony today to kind of give some background on where this bill came from, why we think this is important. You know, I know our committee has really focused on this one issue where you all focus on a lot of important issues. So kind of talking a little bit more about why we think this is urgent now, and then where the idea for this bill came from in terms of the process, and then the process we've gone through so far to get to this point. So just a little bit of context. You guys may have heard that last session, the House Water Committee came together to try and address many of the multifaceted issues with water management and protection in Kansas through a relatively large bill known as the Mega Bill, or House Bill 2686. And this bill you have here today, 2279, is a very small part of that bill. So this bill carries forward the legacy and good work of the former chair, Representative Ron Highland from Wamego, and continues his important work. So again, before kind of diving into the contents of the bill, I wanted to give a bit of an overview of why we think this is such an important issue. So during our last 3 years in the committee, really studying water, there are a number of things that have come to our attention as being urgent as it relates to water quantity, but the decline and the depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer is one that has really grabbed our attention and we think needs to be addressed as soon as possible. So to give you some statistics on the current state of the aquifer, based on data that we've received from KGS and then also research that's been done by Kansas State University, we know that there are large swaths of the aquifer that have 50 years of usable lifetime remaining or less. So that means parts of this aquifer will be gone in my generation's lifetime if we don't do something about it. And regionally, it's estimated that 70% of the aquifer could be gone by 2070. And, that means that towns west of Hayes could start to disappear, that our $5 billion agricultural industry could start to dissipate, and that there could be no future in Western Kansas for families or farmers if we don't start to take action now. And we're not alone in our concerns. Research suggests that 87% of farmers who overlie the aquifer believe that aquifer depletion is a serious or very serious concern. So there's a lot of movement among all groups to try and do something meaningful about this. So I'll kind of skip ahead in my testimony just to kind of talk about, what does our committee think is a potential solution to this? So as the chair mentioned, we think investment in water resources is a critical part, and you'll hear more about that later this week. And then we also think it's equally important to come up with plans. What are we actually going to do about this? And we've gotten a lot of feedback that the best plans are developed locally. So that's the goal of this bill, is to try and incentivize the creation of local plans to address these issues across all of the groundwater management districts. So House Bill 2279 is modeled off of a process that took place first in GMD4 and actually came out of a recommendation provided by an Ogallala committee that met in 2001 and provided recommendations that very much align with the contents of this bill. So that process is essentially to, one, identify all the high priority areas of concern in the groundwater management district. And we have chosen those areas to be areas with 50 years of usable lifetime remaining or less, or areas where an unreasonable deterioration of the quality of groundwater is occurring. I know we got a question on what that means. This is a phrase that is mirrored from our other parts of the groundwater management district statute. So it's my understanding, and DWR can probably talk about this as well, but that is defined in terms of the rules and regulations, and then also through the data that's collected by the Kansas Geological Survey. And then after those high priority areas are identified, the GMD will conduct public education and outreach in high priority areas. So working with all the people in those communities, the water right users, people who care about water, to come up with a plan about what they want to do. So doing a lot of that public engagement to get on the ground input on what these plans look like. And then to actually develop a plan that reasonably addresses those priority areas. I know we also got that question about what does reasonably mean. And that would be determined by the chief engineer, but it's also my understanding that there's legal precedent for the meaning of the term reasonable. So there would be, standards that would apply to. And I hate to put DWR on the spot, but they might also be able to talk more about what that means in practice. And then just to kind of give you an example of how this has been successful, in GMD4, this process was first implemented in part of Sheridan County, which is called Sheridan 6. And after that 2001 Ogallala process, GMD4 went to all the townships and said, this is your aquifer data. What do you want to do about it? And Sheridan 6 says we want to do something now, before it's too late, and we want to do something meaningful. So they came together as a community as Sheridan 6, which covers 100 square miles and almost 200 wells. Their original goal was a 20% reduction in their water use, and to date, they have surpassed that with a nearly 35% reduction in historic use. And on top of that, Dr. Bill Golden from K-State has actually researched and talked to the producers in that area and found out that during that time period, they've actually become more profitable because of the efficiency of their water use and also the decreased cost of their inputs. So not only are farmers using less water, but they're becoming more profitable. And you may hear anecdotes today as well, but we always talk about how in farming communities you get bragging rights because you're like, I grew 300 bushels on 6 inches of corn or whatever it is. And I think that narrative is changing because it's not only we're growing 300 bushels, but we're growing 300 bushels on 6 inches of water. So there's a competition to try and use the least water to grow the most bushels. And I think that
I'm gonna have to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I can. I'll conclude it. Yes. So that kind of concludes my testimony. Just to provide some context, we did have a compromise balloon amendment that went onto the bill, so you'll see a number of changes that was based on stakeholder feedback. And with that, I will be happy to stay on for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your report. So we'll hold questions to the end when we have time or so.
We might, thank you, Mr. Chair, we might head to the House Energy Committee for our joint hearing, but I would be happy to answer questions by email at a later time as well.
Does anybody have any questions for the representative? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And what I hope is a quick question. I know that you've ended up with 2 different reports, one that's focused on the financial, another that comes later after you have information about the results of these action plans. Because they're different dates, but both in January, would you have any objection to combining those as soon as that information is available after 2025?
Yes, thank you, Senator, Mr. Chairman. I wouldn't have any objection to that. I think the groundwater management districts might ask that date be the later date. So if you wanted to combine the dates to be January 31st, I wouldn't see a problem with that. Thank you.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Vaughn, for your presentation. Just a question here, because I'm very familiar with this issue as basically 2 groundwater management districts stretch across my Senate district, which includes 12 counties. Are you aware of how many representatives and how many senators represent these 5 groundwater management districts?
A number, I would imagine. I know, thank you, Senator, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would imagine it's a number, or quite a few. I don't know the exact number. Groundwater management districts 4, 3, and 1 stretch across the entire western half of the state for the most part. So that would be quite a significant number. And then I know 5 is in kind of the south central, and then 2 is outside of the Wichita area. So that would be quite a few, I imagine.
Actually, we'll just go Reno County, because GMD2 only touches a small part of Sedgwick County. Mm-hmm. But from Reno County west, there are only 5 Kansas senators. And for every Senate district, the population you have roughly 3 representatives for each Senate district. So that would mean we only have approximately 15 representatives whose districts, and maybe not even, because a good portion of Western Kansas is not represented by a groundwater management district. Does it concern you at all in trusting this requirement to the legislature?
Thank you, Senator. I think, while the state has an obligation as in terms of ensuring the public interest with the availability of this resource, I would say that while we're ensuring that public interest and the availability of that resource, we're leaving it up to the groundwater management districts to determine what those plans look like. So we see the need for action and we want to encourage that action, but we know that all the groundwater management districts are different and that locals want to have input on what that process looks like. So we're trying to marry those things where we're not requiring folks to come up with a specific plan, but that we're asking them to start moving in that direction because of how serious the issue is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee.
And thank you for your work on this bill, too, so thank you. Next, we have under proponents, Tim Bass, manager of Equispeds and Groundwater. Welcome to the committee, Tim.
Equispeds Groundwater Management District in Halstead, Kansas. Appreciate the opportunity to testify as a proponent of the bill with some noted concerns and some ideas for some improvements to the bill. I did want to just point out real quick the diversity of GMD2. We have about 2,000 wells that withdraw about 57 billion gallons per year, but we have a very diverse group of water users from municipal to agricultural, industrial, stock watering, recreational. In fact, over 500,000 people rely on the Equisped aquifer for drinking water because we also have the City of Wichita metropolitan area that has 55 production wells in our district. Just real quick, GMDs do not receive any state funds. I just wanted to make that clear. I think most of the committee members know that, but we do not receive any state funds. We are fully funded by local assessments of water users and landowners. I did want to point out that GMD2 is quite different than the Western Kansas GMDs. It's obvious that we have a declining problem in Western Kansas. We have our own challenges in South Central Kansas, some slight declines and really a lot of water quality issues. To that point, the GMD2 board has been very proactive. In fact, we had the first 2 IGUCAs in the state, 1980, the McPherson IGUCA. That's an intensive groundwater use control area. We talk about LEMAs. IGUCAs are sort of the predecessors to LEMAs. We have a special management area, also dealing with water quality, which is very much like an IGUCA. We were the first, or one of the first areas in the state to have safe field regulation for reviewing and permitting new wells. We have an extensive monitoring network. We own and maintain over 500 monitoring wells just ourselves. We take about 3,000 water level measurements every year and about 300 water samples. Getting ready to sample all of our wells this year, hopefully, if I have enough funds. So we're gonna do a mass sampling. We're in the process of installing about 29 new monitoring wells in the Burton area. You guys heard about the Burton area a lot with saltwater contamination. We're working with the Kansas Corporation Commission to install a bunch of new monitoring wells in that area. As far as the bill itself, I think we already talked a little bit about the initial report or the annual report for the financial reporting. We are asking for that date to be moved from January 31st to February 28th or March 1st, whatever the committee favors there. And really that is to avoid those duplicative having to submit an unaudited report. We are required to be audited every year. The GMD Act requires an annual audit. It was just submitted to the state of Kansas. So we would ask for that to be moved back. I think that would give us a lot better opportunity to actually submit our audited report rather than having to submit an unaudited and then come back later with an audited. I think Senator Francisco, you pointed on a good point. There's 2 reports that are required. There's one for financial and there's one sort of for activities later on. I think for efficiency purposes, that'd be great to combine those reports and both have them due in that later time frame. I think that would be an efficient use of both the GMD's resources and the legislative resources so that we only have to appear once in front of the committees and provide one report. As far as identifying the areas of concern, we really don't have an issue with that. We've been doing that for a long time. I think we've been the leaders of the GMDs in doing that. I would ask, I think, again, Senator Francisco, you made a very, very good point earlier, that LEMAs are exempt from that first requirement to identify those priority areas. We would ask that IGUCAs be included in that also. We've, like I say, we already have 2 IGUCAs. We also have a similar management area. So I would at least ask for IGUCAs and similar management areas that are already established to be included in that. And I'd be glad to answer your question on that also, Senator Francisco. I think that would only exclude the areas that are in those LEMAs or IGUCAs or special management areas. The rest of the district, if there's other areas, they'd have to be identified by this bill. So just moving on real quick, as part of some additional changes potential to the bill. Again, we have to identify all the areas of concern by July 1st of 2024. There is an opportunity for a deadline. I think it would be more efficient if we just made that December 31st. That would align more with our fiscal year. We run a calendar fiscal year. So rather than July 1st, 2024, I would ask the committee to consider just requiring that to be December 31st of 2024. We're on a pretty short time frame. It seems like that's a long way away, but by the time this bill is heard and passed, that's going to give us about a year. And groundwater models and studies take quite a while to perform, so I would ask for your consideration on that. And then the only other potential revision to the bill that we would ask you to consider is currently the GMDs have very little input into the state water plan fund, how those funds are appropriated. We would ask that in that section of the bill that be considered that GMDs would be considered as being able to have input to the Kansas Water Authority when the state water plan funds are allocated. That's in section 2D on page 4, line 5. Just right now, we just don't have a lot of input in there. We can ask for an outside request, but that's not really very recognized by the Water Authority very often. So we'd ask that can be considered, that language would be added, that the GMD's request for funding from the state water plan. And you're going to hear a lot about state water plan fund tomorrow. There's going to be some extra funds available, and to help the GMDs meet this obligations, we're going to need some additional funding from that source. At that, I stand for some questions.
Seeing none, all in favor? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we have up Aaron Popelka of Kansas Livestock Association. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Aaron Popelka with Kansas Livestock Association, and happy to be here to support this bill. I think one of the things I want to make clear from the get-go is we're guided by member policy. And as a general matter, our policy recognizes that part of the High Plains Aquifer is over-appropriated, and we support strategies to conserve groundwater, but we want those strategies to be led at the local level. We see this bill as a way to ensure that the locals will continue to guide those. And the reason for that is this. I think you've already heard from one GMD, and we'll probably hear from some more others that have taken initiative and done some things to address these issues. Unfortunately, certain GMDs have not taken those steps, in some instances frustrated conservation efforts. We see this as a good balance to make sure that GMDs are moving ahead, identifying these areas that need to be addressed, and taking action plans led at the local level. The chief engineer's only authority here is to make sure these steps are followed, and if not, step in. Hopefully that's not needed. I think one of the things I want to highlight in the bill was initially when this came out in the House, it had a much broader reach. The standard for an area of concern could have encompassed entire GMDs. One of the things we worked with on the House side was to make sure we narrowed this up to the estimated lifetime of groundwater is 50 years or less, so that this isn't too overwhelming for a GMD, so we're focused on those issues that are most at risk. And again, from our members' perspective, we're becoming concerned that, especially with the drought, if things aren't addressed, that the state could step in. Our members don't want to see the chief engineer step in with potentially a more heavy-handed approach. The other thing, I want to address a couple of questions. I know Senator Peck asked about reasonable. I think that's a term particularly used in statutes, often not defined. It often is in case law, and essentially is a standard of an ordinary man under the circumstances. What that does is it gives tremendous flexibility to the entity that has the duty. And so as a chief engineer and his probably legal team at KDA look at this is, would these action plans, are they reasonably linked to that area of that priority area of concern? And it gives them a lot of flexibility to meet that. I think the other thing is on one of the things this does do is address some of the LPA audit concerns about identifying review and revision requirements. You'll see that in there, some of those annual review, or I should say 5-year reviews. One thing I do want to say, again, this does allow a lot of flexibility to the GMDs. I think after the House bill, I've heard some complaints that this is going to force water cuts. Not necessarily. It might be there. For instance, they could do LEMA, and that's one of the things I think Senator Francisco asked was about the safe harbor. One of the things in the safe harbor is if they do a LEMA, that part, let's say, because we got to identify the areas of concern. So if all the areas of concern are already in LEMA, then that's per se exempt. But the first part of that paragraph, Senator, speaks to the chief engineer shall review it. And so perhaps they didn't do LEMA. Maybe they did a voluntary WCA sign up with targets. The chief engineer could look at it and say that's already met, for instance. So it doesn't necessarily mean a LEMA. I wouldn't disagree with Mr. Bays' recommendation to add in IGUCAs. I think that's fine. And from our perspective, the deadline adjustments that Mr. Bays suggested would work well as well. So again, I'm happy to stand here and support this and stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Any questions? Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Aaron, the way I see it, there's LEMAs only in 2 of these GMDs, isn't there? 1 and 4?
That's, I'm only aware of those 2.
Yeah.
Although GMD 1 is, so right now it's in Wichita County, and they're in the process of doing a district-wide.
But this just in one county right now, right? It's not the whole GMD.
Right, but assuming things progress as they've done, the entire GMD will be in a LEMA shortly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Aaron. I just did a quick Google search. Our representing the Kansas Livestock Association, I'm sure you have a great understanding of why we have so much irrigation use in western Kansas. And can you tell me which county was the highest producing corn grower in the state?
Oh boy, I would have to look that up. I don't know off the top of my head.
Honestly, I had to look it up too, but Thomas County, so west of Hayes. And why? Why would Thomas County be growing so much corn?
Yeah, so I would submit that from our members' perspective, we have feed yards and we want to make, and we're there because we're able to grow corn. And I think one of the things, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things, as this has evolved, one of the things that our members are concerned about is as the aquifer declines, it's getting harder and harder to find corn. This year, the drought really stretched our resources, and in fact, some of the feed yards had to rail in corn from the Corn Belt. One of the things our members see as this evolves is that we can find ways to use less water, because one of the things we need are forage close to the feed yards, because it's a lot harder to haul in forage. It's very bulky. And so if we can do things to make sure we have forage resources and then potentially bring in corn, that'll keep those really centers of activity at the feed yards in business. Thank you.
Follow up. Thank you, Aaron. That's exactly my point. The reason we grow so much corn in western Kansas is to supply those feed yards. Very little of that corn that's produced in western Kansas ever leaves western Kansas. So if we had feed yards in Johnson County, say, maybe we wouldn't have as many water problems. Thank you.
You might have some other problems.
Start naming them off. Okay, thank you very much. Next up, we have David Pope, former Chief Engineer, Department of Agriculture. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you very much. Been a number of years since I've appeared before your committee or predecessors in either body. But I am here today to offer some comments on House Bill 2279. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here and support the passage of 2279 as amended by the House. I do believe this legislation is important and necessary to deal with groundwater depletion in the High Plains Aquifer system managed primarily by the groundwater management districts in Kansas. I served as chief engineer for DWR of KDA 1983-2007. At the end of my testimony is a summary of my 50 years of water-related experience in Kansas prior to my retirement, especially related to the water appropriation issue, and including my service as the first manager of the Southwest Kansas Groundwater Management District number 3 between 76 and 78. I believe House Bill 2279 provides a necessary and important process to deal with the management of the High Plains Aquifer and especially the ongoing depletion in the Ogallala portion of the aquifer in western Kansas. I believe the provisions of Section 2 are appropriate and especially important, including the requirements that the GMD identify priority areas of concern in the district, along with setting reasonable boundaries for them based on criteria outlined in the bill and data from Kent's Geologic Survey or other approved sources. The required educational process and outreach, and especially the development of the action plan to reasonably address identified concerns in each area are important and necessary steps in my view, as is the review and approval of the action plan to be submitted to the chief engineer on the defined schedule, as well as the authority to act if the GMD fails to do so. Now, hopefully with the oversight of the chief engineer, these GMD action plans will be effective in substantially reducing the rate of depletion. I appreciate and recognize the progress being made by Northwest Kansas GMD 4 through the establishment of their LEMAs and the existing and proposed LEMAs in western Kansas GMD number 1. So in summary, I support 2279 as amended by the House Committee. There have been several past attempts to address this issue, and now is more important than ever to given the extent of the ongoing depletion, and it is serious. Do not mistake the level of depletion that exists in parts of western Kansas. But to the extent ongoing depletion to deal with this issue as outlined in the bill. I recall various discussions over the years during my time as chief engineer with the GMDs where they were urged to take more action to deal with the ongoing depletion. Some of that has now occurred in certain areas and more needs to be done. And I would actually note, with all due respect to my former employer, GMD3, they're lagging behind in addressing this issue. And it's a very important area. A large amount of our state's irrigation is there, and it had a lot of water to start with in particular. I'm not going to cover all of the details of my experience. I've included that here in the end of the written testimony. I'd note that we've dealt with a lot of issues over the years. I've now been retired 13 years and more since I retired as chief engineer, but 13 years since I quit my consulting practice and went on for a few years after that. I would also note there was mention of the IGUCAs. Of the 8 IGUCAs established during my time working with the state of Kansas, all of these except one are outside of the western Kansas GMDs and the Ogallala Aquifer. There is an upper Arkansas IGUCA stretching from the state line with Colorado along the narrow band of the river down through Ford County. That IGUCA actually only closed the area to new appropriations of water. And so there were no restrictions otherwise by that except metering and some of those things. A number of the other IGUCAs, in fact, have reduced the amount of water that can be pumped, and those are some very extensive and others are in between. But it was a good process, but I think the last IGUCA I established in the Walnut Creek area scared some people because we had to deal with some very, very serious issues to protect senior downstream surface rights being affected by groundwater pumping. But we did the job, and it is now in balance and has been a successful endeavor, both economically in terms of the limited impact as well as dealing with the water shortage. I'd be glad to stand for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Kent Askren from Kansas Farm Bureau. Welcome to the committee, Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Kent Askren with Kansas Farm Bureau, and we stand before you today in support of House Bill 2279. Our policy is very supportive of both the Kansas Water Appropriation Act and the Groundwater Management District Act, and believe that they have very specific purposes and authorities and can and need to work together in harmony to accomplish those purposes. As I was listening to the previous conferees, I think that is, to me, one of the major benefits of House Bill 2279, and that is to bring the issues that groundwater management districts are working on a daily basis before this committee and House Water Committee to help get a greater understanding of the challenges that they are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and then to help get the legislative support that is needed to ultimately deal with those challenges. And when we do, as previous speakers mentioned, have enormous challenges before us. We have a tremendous economic driver in the use of water in western Kansas in particular. It has an enormous economy that's helped Kansas, helped the region, helped the nation as a whole. And but it's come at a cost, no question about it. We cannot sustain that level of usage indefinitely. There will come a day of reckoning, and we've already experienced that in some areas of the state. So we have to make sure that we are being honest about the issue and what we can do to make the best of it. Because if we try to address the issue while we still have abundant water, that will be a much less difficult challenge than when we wait and there is very little water left. So the goal, establishing the correct goals, I think is going to be paramount to establishing solutions here. We were extremely encouraged by some data that came out of the Kansas Geologic Survey a few years ago, what they call Q-stable. It gave us a perspective on some reductions that would be needed to achieve at least short-term sustainability. That was much less cuts in water usage than what we had been told in the past. And so that was extremely encouraging. But one thing that is of utmost importance to us and our membership is the protection of adequate water for domestic use moving forward. And that has not been in the conversation very much, not in policy, not in the legislature. And we just want to make sure that you're aware. We'd be happy to visit with you individually about that if need be. But we want to bring up the issue of domestic water use and how that fits in with the management of our water resources all across the state, but particularly in those areas that are most depleted. Each one of these groundwater management districts is very unique, I think, and again, that is one real benefit of House Bill 2279 is them having the opportunity to stand before you and share those unique attributes that they all face. And I think as you hear those unique challenges, you're going to recognize that they need to come up with unique solutions, and that's where the local input is going to be very, very beneficial. And I want to point out, before I forget, I did make one mistake on page 2 there. I referred to House Bill 2303. That should be 2302. Please make that correction on on your written testimony that I provided. But that is going to be a bill that you're going to be hearing, and it is going to be essential, I believe, into dealing with the challenges that we're talking about here with 2279, because 2302 will deal with the funding. We must have funding to help with the voluntary incentive-based programs that could possibly help us reach those reductions that I mentioned in the Kansas Geologic Survey reports. So, final thing I want to say is that we believe that there's definitely a statute that gives guidelines for how the Groundwater Management District Act and the Water Appropriation Act are designed to work hand in glove together, and we strongly encourage that and would appreciate any support from the committee to helping address any challenges that there are in making that happen. So, Mr. Chairman, I know you have a lot of conferees. I'll stop there, but be happy to answer any questions if I can.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Shannon Kenyon from Groundwater Management District number 4. Welcome to the committee, Shannon.
I'm sure. Good morning, Chairman, thank you, and members of the committee. My name is Shannon Kenyon. I am the manager for the Groundwater Management District number 4 out of Colby, Kansas. I am here before you today as we are proponents of House Bill 2279. The first part of that bill, dealing with the financials and having that transparency, we highly support. We really take an interest in the fact that you would be interested in how we operate and utilize our funds. Then, thirdly, we as GMDs are all, yes, very unique. The 3 Western ones, though, are also, we do share some of the same issues, and one of those is decline problems and issues that we all need to address, but we do those in unique ways. Some of the process that's outlined in 2279 is really exactly how we have done it in GMD4 in developing our 2 LEMAs. The first one being the Sheridan 6 LEMA, which took many years to develop, but we had a lot of hurdles to go through as far as getting the law changed and being able to implement the local enhanced management areas. But after we paved the way for that, we began looking at something that was more broader, that dealt with decline issues throughout the rest of the district. And so those areas that do have a decline problem, we have included into the GMD4 LEMA. And we actually, through the public outreach process and revising, we developed that in about 2 years. It took another year to get that through the hearing process and things like that. But that was definitely implemented a lot faster than the previous LEMAs. So, you know, we're doing something and we're addressing it. Are we there yet? You know, sustained? No, but we are going to continue to work on that. So, and we want to encourage others to do that as well. GMD1, who you'll hear from, is also involved in that process and is utilizing the same process that we did to develop these to address our declines. So if we don't do something, the economics that are tied to Western Kansas and the agriculture that this depends upon, and not just agriculture, but, you know, agriculture feeds that economy for the most part, but there's a lot of other industry in the area as well. So, you know, yeah, we do have very low representation here at the State House, but everybody has a stake in this. You know, and if we don't do something and it goes dry, that's going to have an effect on, first of all, the local economy. That's going to filter to the state, the nation, and it's going to have a ripple effect globally as well. So I would entertain any questions if anybody has any. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this presentation and previous information you've given us. So I particularly appreciate what GMD4 has done. I understand that your LEMAs are based on a 5-year cycle. Because of that, would it make a difference if your 5-year report was coordinated with that 5-year cycle? The report that's being required, or the 5-year action plan deadlines, would that help if it were coordinated with the length of those LEMAs?
Yeah, Thank you for that question. It would make my life a lot easier.
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. GMD4, how many counties are in the Lima?
Well, within the GMD4 Lima, there are 9.
9 counties?
Correct. Not, some of those are just portions of those counties, but I believe
It's
that's,
Thomas County.
all of Thomas County is included.
Thank you.
Seeing any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Next up, we have Katie Durham from the Groundwater Management District Number 1 Manager. Welcome to the committee.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee. I'm happy to be here. GMD1 is testifying in support of House Bill 2279, and so I'll kind of go through a couple things here, and then I've been jotting down some extra notes that I want to touch on real quickly as well. But GMD1 out of Scott City, Kansas encompasses parts of 5 different counties, including Lane, Scott, Wichita, Wallace, and Greeley counties. One of the things I kind of wanted to give a little bit more information on was just kind of the background of how we've gotten to right now, and I'll go through some dates here, but since 2013, GMD1 has been working on outreach and education, which has included facilitating public meetings focused on developing both water conservation areas and locally enhanced management areas, and has also provided cost share opportunities for our local producers. From 2013 to current, we have seen the importance of this continued outreach in communities across the district, and it is important that these past efforts, policies, and programs also be a part of the discussion when assessing the productivity of the district. One thing that I would like to highlight is the success that public outreach has played in the development of the Wichita County WCA, Wichita County Lima, and Ford County Lima. So I know there were some questions that pertain to those Limas and their statuses. So the Wichita County Lima is in its 3rd year, and the WCA actually did begin back in 2017. So from that, now we're actually able to see some trends that are showing some of the results of both the WCA and of the Wichita County Lima. In addition, the Ford County Lima was submitted on July 1st of last year. That Ford County Lima would essentially make it so that all of GMD1 is in an active Lima. As of February 2nd, we had our final hearing on that, and at this point, from what we're hearing, all signs point to we are expecting to receive the final order on that Lima, which would go into effect as of January 1st of this year. So our producers are already planning and operating within the structure of that Ford County Lima. So one of the things that's important to note is the hugely crucial structure of those outreach meetings. So in May, one of the things we ended up doing was going to each individual county that would be in a part of the Ford County Lima and having a really dynamic dialogue with producers and giving them an opportunity to look at what their allocation would be for the 5-year period, and provided information from Kansas Geological Survey. Bronnie Wilson gave presentations so that they could see their specific areas of concern and how this Lima was going to affect their specific area. The dialogue from those meetings was absolutely imperative in making sure that this plan was cohesive and was truly a grassroots effort. That is why I think we've seen such a rally behind the plan, and many supporters within the community, both whether it's stock water holders, municipalities, or irrigators or dry land operators. So additionally, one thing to point out, so with the Wichita County WCA, prior to the establishment of the 2017 water WCA and Water Conservation Area, and then eventually the Lima, the average rate of decline in the aquifer was approximately ½ a foot a year. Now with the implementation of the Wichita County WCA, along with the Lima, recent data is pointing us to indicate that the approximate annual decline has decreased to roughly 1/10 of a foot per year, which we'll continue to monitor as these programs continue across the district. And then one final note, as a public entity focused on service, transparency and active reporting is very important in earning and keeping the respect and the trust of the communities that we serve, and therefore we see no concern with the parameters of the bill, and GMD1 certainly does support House Bill 2279 and working further with these committees in the future. So, any questions?
Very much. Any questions for Senator Francisco.
Thank you. You mentioned the average decline rate, and I know that one of the areas of concern we're looking at is the usable lifetime. Another indicator could be decline.
Sure.
Is there a decline rate that you've seen that says this would be a priority of concern for our groundwater district?
Sure. I mean, obviously, and we've kind of heard a little bit about the Q stable numbers and so on and so forth. And there are some numbers from the Kansas Geological Survey that specific to Wichita County has indicated that in a normal year, they would be, roughly around 28, I think, to about 30% would be the decline that they would need to go to be stable. And within the Wichita County, Lima, and the WCA, they are starting to see, approximately about a 27 to 28% reduction of where they're kind of laying. And their Lima actually was a 25%. So we're seeing a greater reduction in pumping than was even structured within the Lima. And so I think using those sorts of numbers and figures and trends to kind of assess the decline and reasonable life is appropriate, and that's something we would continue to monitor.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question here. How long has GMD1 been measuring the groundwater levels there?
Yeah, so beginning in 1973, and I guess one question would be for Brownie when the index well program officially began. 2007. So 2007 would be that, and forgive me, I was not here at that point. But it's been quite a while. I mean, I think in comparison to other states that I've worked in water resource management, we by far have a lot more data available to us than some others I could compare it to.
Questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we have Rex Buchanan, former director of the Kansas Geological Survey. Welcome to the committee, Rex.
Thank you, Senator Kirshen, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Rex Buchanan. I'm the director emeritus of the Kansas Geological Survey, where I worked from 1978 to 2016. I still help out a little bit, mostly on earthquake-related issues and the annual water level measurements that you've heard about, but I am, for the most part, retired. I want to make it clear that I'm speaking today on my own behalf and not representing the Kansas Geological Survey. I grew up on a farm in central Kansas, and I've spent most of my life in the state. I still own ground in central Kansas. I've been engaged in natural resource issues for virtually all of my career, and I believe that water in general and the depletion of the High Plains Aquifer in particular are among the most important issues facing the state of Kansas long term. House Bill 2279 is a reasonable step toward extending the life of the High Plains Aquifer. I can't speak to the financial reporting requirements in Section 1 of the bill, but I do think requiring a plan to deal with groundwater depletion as outlined in Section 2 is an appropriate expectation for groundwater management districts. In fact, this bill represents a management approach that combines local control in the form of groundwater management districts with state control. By Kansas law, water is a public resource that is dedicated to the use of the people of the state. So clearly, the state has a role to play here. But just as clearly, groundwater management districts were created with the belief in the importance of local control. Combining state and local control in a cooperative way is, I believe, a creative and typically Kansan approach to addressing the issue of groundwater depletion. Now, various approaches and models can help identify the areas that we've talked about and assess their prospects. Additional monitoring, index wells, and aquifer models can contribute. For example, it was work at the Geological Survey in the early 2000s that identified the areas within groundwater management districts that helped form the basis for delineating the first local enhanced management area, or LEMA, that you've talked about already. The resulting Sheridan County LEMA has been a true success story for water management, not just in the state, but even the nation. But developing additional groundwater data and models, as important as that is, should not defer action. Groundwater declines have been apparent for decades, and while declines have slowed in some areas, the most recent data show that last year's declines in groundwater levels in the High Plains Aquifer were among the greatest since 1995. Now, obviously, some of that decline was related to drought, but drought only exacerbates long-term trends. We know enough today to take this action. Asking the groundwater management districts to present a plan of response is reasonable, appropriate, and if anything, overdue. Again, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you particularly for the time and attention that you are devoting to this critical issue. I'd be glad to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Any questions for Mr. Buchanan? Not seeing any. Thank you very much. Do you have one? Oh, Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think my question earlier was misunderstood about the declines. I so much appreciate the decline in use that we're seeing in the groundwater district. My concern was trying to have another way to identify an area of concern. And so maybe you can't, you speak off the top of your head, but I'm wondering if an average, what average 5-year decline rate would make you think this would be, should be an area of concern? I mean, is it half a foot? Is it a foot?
Decline over a 5-year period? Average annual decline
Average over a 5-year.
I would be really reluctant to stand here and answer that question off the top of my head. And also, again, and I think this goes to the point of groundwater management districts, I think it depends a lot on where you are. In those areas that have a lot more water to begin with, I think that answer might be different than it would be in areas, say, like West Central in that GMD that has less water to begin with. So I would be really reluctant to give you a blanket answer to that question standing here today.
That's fair.
Any other questions for
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Committee, we noticed that that was the last of our proponents. We also have written proponent testimony in written. It's Justin Cobb, Nature Conservancy, Josh Roque, Kansas Corn Growers, David Barfield, Resource Water Consultant, Tom Jones, member managing of the High Plains Feed Yard, and Jinga Jiga Circle Land and Cattle Corporation, also written testimony. On or does anybody else have any written testimony we don't know about? We'll move on. Neutral, we have in person Mark Rude, Director of South Groundwater Management District Number 3. Committee, does somebody have to leave, have to go? We can suspend it and finish it tomorrow. Oh, okay. All right. Mr. Rude, go right ahead. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Mark Rude. I'm Executive Director of the Southwest Kansas Groundwater Management District office in Garden City. To be very brief, I tried to provide you written testimony that's extremely brief and is to the point. We are neutral. A lot of good testimony you've heard already. There's some key points we'd like to have you consider to improve the bill. Some of them have been mentioned already, things like make one report, not multiple reports with different financial numbers. That can be very confusing. Also, deadlines. We'd like to see the deadlines for actions of the board delayed by 6 months, partly because our groundwater model, with the help of Kansas Geological Survey, has had a 6-month delay, plus our fiscal year is 6 months later than the deadlines in the bill. So that would help us out tremendously, particularly with a small office. In brief, I'm going to point out on page 2 of the bill, there's a couple of terms in there, usable lifetime and unreasonable deterioration. Those are controversial terms. The point there that the board wanted to make is it's best to leave these terms defined by the local board in their work to target these areas. Things like usable, for example, is a word that governs the water supply Kansas gets from Colorado. And it's like usable water, the way we define it in our management program, is really quality and quantity, two sides of the same coin. If you don't consider them together, you're not really considering the value of that water supply. So usable can be a controversial term, but we can handle that if you allow definition at the local level. Let's see. I think I'll just skip to the last point on the last page of the bill, page 4. There's some very good language in there to support groundwater management districts, the funding of agencies that work to support the districts in their efforts to carry out the purposes of this bill. for some reason, the groundwater management districts are left out. We would like some language inserted in there that the funding of the state water plan funds and the budgeting of that can include requests of groundwater management districts. So in brief, in summary, happy and anxious to make regular reports to the legislature on what we're up to on our implementation of our management program. We certainly are doing that with our annual reports of the Western Water Conservation Projects Fund. We've had a lot of success in leveraging in the last 10 years local funds with federal funds to essentially double the investment of our members for water conservation projects. And we'd like to be able to continue that work and carry out the purposes of the bill with these additions in my testimony.
All right, thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Rood? Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rood, for being here. So you mentioned 3 reports. I know that there's 2 identified in the bill. Are you adding the program management review, or?
Thank you for the
help me
question.
understand that?
Yeah. The way we see the language in that first section, we would have to provide, because of the deadlines involved, both an audited and an estimated report. There's 2, plus the one at the end of the bill. That's 3.
And then the program management review is the 4th annually, right? We don't see that from the legislature, but you still have to do that.
Yeah, I mean, whatever we need to do, we will do. It's just easier with a small staff if we can consolidate that.
Francisco.
Thank you. And can you help me understand this extension? You know, I know that the legislature is probably also looking at when would we see those reports? And if that work isn't started until December, then certainly it's going to be after the legislative session before that's ready for review.
Yes, Senator, we'll provide you whatever is most helpful. We can certainly do, say, a January 15th report, but with estimated budget numbers and not audited. Or we could go later after our audit and include audited numbers. So I think I put in there a March 1st. That's pretty late in the session, but it's certainly a date that we could all talk from audited numbers. But we'll work with whatever is best for the legislature.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I'm not articulating my questions very well, obviously, this morning. So I'm talking about the deadline in your second ask. You asked about the single annual report, and then the next one, we asked that the deadlines in this bill be extended by 6 months.
Oh, thank you very much. The deadlines, like the one for the board to submit the priority areas of concern, if that was delayed 6 months, that would be at the end of the calendar year, the end or the beginning of our fiscal year. And so that would align that deadline and other deadlines to our fiscal. We expect that with this outreach and conversation that there will be more verified claims submitted, which will lower our income and have I mean, if everybody that doesn't pump water that files verified claims, I mean, we could have a $300,000 negative impact on our annual budget. So it'd be best if this was aligned with our fiscal process so that we can make adjustments as appropriate, if that makes sense.
Not yet, but I'll try to talk to you afterwards.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Next we have, I tell the committee, thank you for your patience, and we're going to hear you guys out while you're here instead of making them come back for another trip. So, Mr. Butler, you come forward and make your remarks. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Jim Butler. I'm a senior scientist with the Kansas Geological Survey, a research and service unit of the University of Kansas. I am speaking on behalf of our director, Jay Kalbus, who testified before this committee on Thursday but could not make it today. I think most of you are aware that the Kansas Geological Survey takes no position on legislation, so we are neutral on House Bill 2279. However, we did want to draw the committee's attention to one element of this bill, that being Section 2A1. In our opinion, a sound and defensible approach for defining priority areas of concern would be one based on the comprehensive water level and water use data that we have in the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas. Kansas is recognized nationally and even internationally for the high quality of these data sets, their lengthy durations of record, and how they can be readily used to characterize groundwater systems. The Kansas Geological Survey is certainly willing to work with the GMDs, DWR, and other interested entities on such approaches. And with that, I'd be happy to to stand for questions if the chair deems it appropriate.
Questions for Mr. Butler? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for all the past information on water data and for being here. So you're talking about identifying these priority areas of concern based on data. One suggestion that's been made and is made in this bill is the estimated usable lifetime of groundwater. And I'm assuming that would be based on data from the Geological Survey. Is there some better way to define this?
Well, Senator, thank you for your question. Now, the KGS is responsible for these maps of the estimated usable lifetime. And we have our latest public information circular that just came out last month, and I'd be happy to distribute to the committee after my comments. We use these maps as an illustration for the general public about what the future could hold for the High Plains Aquifer in western Kansas. We did not envision that these maps would be used for regulatory purposes, because these are projections into the future, and they're based on a series of assumptions, and so they should be considered as just one possible future for the High Plains Aquifer. What we would like these priority areas of concern to be based on the hard, cold data that we have, and we have excellent data on water level changes that go back decades, and we have excellent data on water use, which is very rare here in the United States. So we know how much the aquifer is being stressed across its extent. We can use these data, and the Kansas Geological Survey used them in the past to identify the priority areas in GMD4, which led to the Sheridan 6 Lima. We would prefer that the areas of concern, these priorities, areas of concern, to be based on the data. Does that answer your question?
I think that helps me understand the concern, but we have to come up with particular words that help us say to all of the GMDs, here's, if this is what you measure, this we want to be considered a area of concern. And so I think many of us have seen these maps over the years and appreciate them and thought, well, that's helpful. But how else? I mean, I don't think we can say the areas of concern should be based on data, because then it isn't saying where you have the cutoff. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I thought you had ended right there. The process that was used to identify the areas in GMD4 back years ago, we can put that in, I mean, the folks putting the legislation together. I mean, obviously, the Kansas Geological Survey is not involved in this, but they could use the language associated with that process to define what we would, I think, would be a very reasonable and sound and defensible. Let's make sure we have a sound and defensible approach here.
Thank you.
Any final questions? I guess we can visit after the meeting's over, but thank you again for coming out. We appreciate that for the information you had. And that was neutral testimony, by the way. So, committee, any other comments? Otherwise, we will close the hearing on House Bill 2279 and have a good day.